has wrought against the backdrop of a national reckoning on racial injustice. There is no going back because normal was insufficient, inadequate, and unjust to begin with. So this is a movement. It is not a moment. The fact that there is a national discussion about reparations, about whether or not to defund the police, even about the cancellation of student debt, is all indicative of the power of the movement. Because the Black Lives Matter movement, to be clear, is just a continuation of the civil rights movement. It's a new chapter. The civil rights movement never ended. You know, actually, I was talking to a friend of mine, Rashad Robinson from Color of Change, and he's like, no, we're still in our infancy. When it comes to the movement, we're still like, you know, these people like to have you think this is like a beginning, middle, and end. You know, like Medgars was murdered, and, you know, King gave a speech, and John Lewis crossed the bridge, and then Rosa sat down, and Black folks were free. No. So the Black Lives Matter movement, which is why it bothers me when people, even Black folks, try to undermine the movement or allow it to be co-opted. The tradition of Black activists and freedom riders and foot soldiers is that we are community builders. We're not destroyers. So whoever's doing that, those are infiltrators. They don't represent this movement because this is a movement that, yes, expresses righteous rage, but that righteous rage is informed by a radical love for our community and our people, and a self-determination. So this is not a moment, it is a movement, but just like the early chapters of the civil rights movement, folks were boycotting, organizing, mobilizing. Y'all ain't serious about boycotting because Black folks don't want to be inconvenienced. That's a conversation for another day as the number one consumers in the country. That's a conversation for another day. But, you know, because when you look at Montgomery, that was 392 days. Y'all ready to say for 392 days, I'm going to walk 6 miles to work? Okay. We need some of that. So all I'm saying is that organizing, that mobilizing, that sacrifice was all about legislation. That is what resulted in the 1964 and 65, respectively, Voting Rights and Civil Rights Act. So now the Black Lives Matter movement is transitioning to the movement for Black lives, which is about policy. Because Black folks have had legislated hurt and harm, and it's been very precise. That's why race-neutral policies don't serve us. We need to be unapologetically saying, I want a policy that sees me, that names my pain, and that is unapologetic in saying, we're moving this for Black folk. Because the harm that was caused to us named us specifically. It was very precise. So now we have to get to the legislation because this is systemic hurt. So now we need to legislate equity. Do y'all hear me? Equality is not equity. So the movement had to evolve. So now we have to legislate equity. We need to legislate healing. We need to legislate justice because hate, hurt, and harm were legislated very precisely. So now we can precisely legislate equity, healing, and justice. And by the way, I do believe that Black lives and the value of our lives can and should be codified in our budgets. Let me say this. Thank you, everyone, for your likes and your retweets and for the T-shirts, which I don't even know if you bought from somebody Black. But the only receipts that matter right now, the only receipts that matter are policies and budgets. That's it. That's the path forward.
So, Mr. Chair, I have to do a commercial.
Okay,
I'm sorry.
I'm going to pick up on 2 points that she's raised. Go ahead.
Yeah, I got to do this commercial now. Okay, because I think it's really relevant to what everyone is asking in the chat. So at the Urban League, we're proud to be one of the lead organizers of what we're calling the 1619 Project. This is a coalition like none of the coalitions we've seen before in that over 40 Black and Brown-led organizations committed to protecting the right to vote have come together to make sure that on election day and before, We're getting people out. We're watching the polls. We're doing all that we can to make sure that things go the way they should on election day. We recruited over 400 volunteers, and we need more to cover the polls in Boston. There are 255 polls there. In Brockton, there are 21. And in Randolph, there are 7. And we're asking our Urban League in Springfield to cover the western part of the state for us as well. The 1619 project will be utilizing the expertise of Mass Vote, but also the Lawyers for Civil Rights for field operations, for managing our statewide hotline, and for watching our social media threats. So if you wish to volunteer, send an email to info, that's INFO, at ulem.org. info@ulem.org. And so I just had to get that in because there's been so much asking us around what's going to be happening. Thank you, Shauna, for getting that out there for us. I see you put that in the chat for me, and I appreciate seeing you on today. So I had to get that out there because I know how passionate you are about this whole moment, an opportunity for us to continue this movement as we go forward around voting and all of that.
And Chancellor, I do want to just, because the chat is lighting up, and I want to be clear, nobody's dodging any questions in the chat because we've answered 4 questions from the chat. So let's keep that going. Okay, so we have a question in here about Ice Cube's contract with Black America and reparations and Black men versus Black women. Okay, so let me get at that. All right. So yes, I support H.R. 40, which is the legislation introduced by Representative Sheila Jackson Lee, which is ostensibly a study of how do we manifest reparations. It is not a bill to enact reparations. It is a bill to study what is the form of reparations. And I don't know how you put a price tag on it because we are still experiencing ancestral trauma from the Middle Passage. So I don't know what price tag you put on it, but I'm trying to get at it through the policies that I introduce. So to your point about Ice Cube's contract with Black America, yes, I've read it. And in fact, a couple of the things that he enumerated in there, I've introduced legislation that actually accomplishes. One of those things is a bill I introduced with Senator Booker, which is a baby bonds bill, which when a child is born, it would create a seed account. That child would access that account when they turned 18. And I think it could be really game changing because let's say, that $1,000 bond accrues to $25,000, $30,000. That's a down payment for a home that can support someone in higher education or in starting a business, right? And so that baby bonds bill that I introduced with Senator Booker and other bills that I've introduced, like qualified immunity, speak to many of the tenets that Ice Cube proposed in that contract with Black America. Again, this is nonpartisan, but I would also say that I have seen some of those policies modeled in the Lift Every Voice agenda that has been introduced by the candidate that I'm supporting. Now, on this Black woman, Black man narrative, I think this is not a new challenge for us. We have got to be ambidextrous when it comes to our oppression and not territorial or competitive. This is not a matter of if I am my brother's keeper or if I am my sister's keeper. This is the acknowledgement that our destinies are tied, and we both need to do a better job in that regard. I also want you to know, because of the briefings that I have access to, that the foreign interference in our elections and the disinformation campaigns that have effectively moved to try to suppress or influence our votes are not only just targeting Black folk, they are targeting Black men. And that has been supported. So that is one thing happening on these anonymous social media platforms. But then when it comes to the public discourse, we all have to do a better job at being more intentional. We have got to do a better job. And I do think that basically the scales tip. There was a long time when the only time you heard about Black and brown boys the only time you heard about at and proven risk Black boys and men, that was what dominated the narrative. And girls were growing up in the same conditions, and that was not being discussed at all. I remember when I ran for the Boston City Council, Black folks would say to me, you're talking about the girls, but it's the Black boys that are dying. And I said, absolutely. And it's the Black women that are raising those boys. And by the way, the Black girls are growing up in the same conditions, and we don't have the same numbers of them dying to gang violence on these streets, but they're slowly dying right in front of you. And no one sees them. So we're not going to play the oppression Olympics. We're going to acknowledge that our freedoms and our destinies are tied. And we need to be doing the work intentionally. Verbiage and how we speak is very important. So that advocacy begins with how we speak. And it's not playing into that narrative. But I do think that we have struggled. And so sometimes the scales tip and you're only hearing about Black boys and men. And then sometimes they tip and you're only hearing about Black girls and women. I want to take issue with that frame of Black girl magic, because I would never give short shrift to our magic. But I think it takes something away from us, and that is our agency. I know a lot less about Black girl magic and a lot more about Black woman work. Okay? And so what I would just say is that we all need to be putting in that work. And I welcome, I'm looking in the chat just to make sure I'm answering the questions.
Well, I want to get to you before you get to the chat there, Congresswoman, because I'm always appreciative of your deep thinking, thought, and actions. Is evident by your responses here. And I'm going to give you two areas coming back to and introduce one which I know is near and dear to you and me. But one of them is this question of the disparity that takes place in terms of income. We've had to study in terms of the Fed. We know that historically we were, even by federal and state policies, Black folks were denied the opportunities in terms of the various VA loans, FHA loans, the redlining, et cetera. So I want you to talk to that disparity issue that was in the chat. And then the other one that's near and dear to you and me is this whole question of mental illness. You know that I've served with NAMI, I've served with the Mass Association of Mental Health, and with Samaritans Inc. on that. We know that during this crisis, that situation has intensified. We know that the issues in terms of domestic violence have intensified. What are some of the thoughts and thinkings that you have on both of those points? Because I know we're coming close to the time frame and may not get to all of them, but I would like for you to address those two if you would.
Okay, so the disparities in lending and those sorts of things, is that what you said? Yeah,
the disparity issue, and then the one in terms of the whole question of mental illness. I know you were heading up some committees around mental illness as well during your tenure as our Congresswoman.
Okay, I'm trying to think of the most succinct way to get to that question again. So I do serve on financial services, and so, we have all banking and monetary policy. We work on student debt, housing issues, homelessness, just to name a few. And one of the things that we are actively working on is to modernize the Community Reinvestment Act. The CRA right now, I don't want to get too wonky. Okay, 98% of our financial institutions continue to pass these CRA examinations, which would infer that they're not practicing redlining. But we know that that is not true. Mm-hmm. And so by modernizing the Community Reinvestment Act and being race specific, that allows us to identify bad actors and to address that. Okay, so that's the one thing I would say about redlining, because we know Black homeownership is the lowest it's now than since the Fair Housing Act was introduced. This is the lowest the Black homeownership has been. Really quickly, someone is asking me about trade schools. I don't know if People's Academy is in this chat, but big shout out to them. Absolutely, college is not for everyone. And we need to be investing in trade schools. We need to be investing in schools that support our young people learning coding. That is also critically important. So I can't get to everything in the chat. I'm so sorry. But I have a member of my staff in here. Okay, y'all. So she will screenshot all these questions and we will figure out how I can get these to you, whether I'm going to respond on my social media platforms. Maybe I'll do an Insta Live. We'll figure it out. Okay. Absolutely invest in Madison Park. Absolutely. Okay. I got to get to the question here. So on mental health, I do appreciate that we have seen, more people accessing mental health services under this pandemic because of the stressors, because of the isolation. And we have heard very encouraging things from people who for the first time are getting their traumas dealt with because of telemedicine and video calls and things like that. But again, because we do have a digital divide, and the House has approved legislation to make those investments in infrastructure, because just like with our kids in our schools, you can give everyone a Chromebook, but they don't have a hotspot. That doesn't mean anything. And so in the midst of this pandemic, where we see more and more people struggling with mental health challenges, it's very critical that we are doing everything possible to make sure that those services are equitably accessed. And that is about federal investment. And so, again, we have moved on these things on the House side, but we just need to change the direction of the country so we can advance those things on the Senate side. But it is also why I support Medicare for all, because I do believe that access to health care and behavioral health and mental health is health care, should be equitably accessed, and it should be a human right. Because, again, our greatest wealth as a nation is the health of our people. And we're only seeing, just speaking about Black boys, they represent the highest demographic right now. The highest, the fastest growing demographic of youth that are vulnerable to suicide. There's a lot of Black boys and a lot of Black men suffering in silence. And that has also been laid bare in the midst of this pandemic.
Well, there's two pieces here, and I'm not sure Dr. Motley and I are who's going to be asking you this. I know, Dr. Motley, why don't you go ahead with Shirley Chisholm and with the John Lewis question? Why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, because we're getting ready to sort of wind down. But before we do that, I don't want to miss the opportunity to thank you for your skillful way of doing what we haven't been doing to date on these programs, which is getting into the chat, weaving it into the conversations in the way that allow us to not dodge questions, but answer the questions. And the other thing is that we want all of the folk in our program who are attending the program to know there's an opportunity before we come on to help us shape the questions for our guests. And so we appreciate you today for your skillful navigation, Congresswoman, on this. But one of my favorite Black women ever is Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm. And as she...
my fellow New Yorker.
And as she sort of is with, I see, and there you go. And as she is up there dancing with the ancestors because of your ability to do what you've been able to do, I understand that you're sitting in that unbossed and unbought office space down in, Washington. Does that give you a greater sense of responsibility? And then also, that your colleague and the person who just joined her as an ancestor, Congressman John Lewis, talks about the vote being precious. It's almost sacred. And it's the most powerful nonviolent tool we have in democracy. What is the message you want to relay to the community about this year's election and that sacred right as we close this session with you?
Oh, my goodness. I want to get to all these questions in the chat. My staff is telling me, you can't get to them. You got to get to the next thing. Okay.
Yeah.
So but I'm really quickly trying to...
We'll blow through some of those and
come so let me just
really
quickly try to get through some of this stuff, mostly because I also want folks to know that these are things that I'm working on and very effective.
Break them down.
Because I have a dedicated team. So I want to just say that as, talking about economic justice and social and economic mobility, transportation is really critical to that. And that has been for many considered really a state issue, but that is because the federal funding formula is an antiquated one, which really perpetuates many of these disparities. But we know that Livable Streets did a report that showed that Black Boston bus riders ride an additional 60 hours in comparison to their white peers. So that means that we are riding, waiting, and transferring longer to get to school, to get to a job, to get to a healthcare appointment. So that has devastating impacts. So I've created the Future of Transportation Caucus. It's one of the things I'm proudest of in my tenure, other than having the reputation and the record for introducing more bills than any other freshman member. But I've established the Future of Transportation Caucus to completely transform our federal funding, to invest in multimodal infrastructure, to prioritize public transit, to prioritize busing infrastructure, and also biking and walking. And it's based on these principles: equity, accessibility, sustainability, and connectivity. So I created the Future of Transportation Caucus. So please follow that work. The other thing is on the issue of trade schools. The reason we need to invest in real trade schools is so that our kids are not preyed upon by for-profit colleges who have predatory marketing and deceptive business practices because they set our kids up to fail, or our adults, our veterans, anyone seeking to get a hand up, develop their skills to be more competitive. These schools have a long track record. I also work on consumer protection in financial services. And so I started going after these for-profit colleges and universities with deceptive business practices and predatory behavior, setting our families up to default, then to have a bad credit score. I'm doing a very game-changing work on credit repair. Please have me come on and talk about that, because your credit score determines everything. Right. Whether or not you can rent an apartment, purchase a home, get a job. We are doing some really transformative reforms around credit, the credit reporting system, and credit repair. Okay, I think that's all that I can get to right now on some of the things that I've seen in the chat. Now, to answer your question, it is an incredible honor to sit in Longworth 1108. Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm had 3 offices in her 8-year tenure in the House. This was one of them. I certainly feel her good mojo. But honestly, growing up, raised by the Black woman that I was, who told me early on, it is a beautiful thing to be Black. You should be proud to be Black, but you are being born into a struggle, and I expect that you will do your part in that struggle. So the Chisholm quote that I revisit the most, when she was asked how she wanted to be remembered, is simply as a Black woman who dared to be herself. So I want to say thank you to the people of the Massachusetts 7th, whose trust and confidence in votes I earned, and who emboldened me to be this bold, unapologetic Black woman navigating the corridors of power, policy and decision-making tables, bringing the Massachusetts 7th with me, and my ancestors on my back and in my heart, and ordering my steps in everything that I do. I want to just say thank you for that. And yes, the vote, it is your voice. In this moment, this is also the resistance and the affirmation, in my opinion. It is a resistance of corruption and cruelty and chaos, and it is an affirmation of our democracy and of justice. Now, I'll give you the real. I don't know that everything you want will be accomplished simply because we change leadership. But I know that nothing you need will be accomplished if we keep who we have. So forget 4 more years. This country and Black folks cannot afford 4 more minutes under this administration. Well,
listen, Congresswoman, you got people writing me from Pittsburgh and everywhere else across the country saying, stop rocking, man. You're rocking too much. But you had me rocking like I was sitting in the front row in church as a little boy again. And so thank you today for just being an incredible guest and an incredible part of our community and an incredible leader. I also want to thank my co-host, Chairman Joe Feaster. But most importantly, I want to thank everyone in the audience, those who thought I was rocking too much and those who didn't. And I did that. So thank our audience for tuning in today, and look out for our next Leaders Over Lunch. She'll be back, I'm sure, at some point. Become a member of the Urban League as well. Visit our website, www.ulem.org, for more details. Sign up for the 1619 Project. Send an email to info@ulem.org. And now we have to bid adieu. But thank you all for coming out. Thank you, Congresswoman.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you
to
so
you
much.
and your team.
Dr. Motley.
All right. Thank you.
Have a-
Powerful.